Thank you all for coming to what is the second in our series called The Big Picture, being sponsored by the Brady-Johnson program in Grand Strategy. My name is Beverly Gage. I'm the director of that program, and I am a professor here in the history department. I'm delighted to welcome Kim Phillips-Fein and Max Boot, who I will introduce in a little more detail in a moment, for this discussion of an issue that is really critical to the politics of our time, as well as the politics of the past and the future, as the title suggests, American Conservatism, Past, Present, and Future. I want to say a few words about this series itself and the idea behind this particular format and the way that we try to frame our conversations. In the Grand Strategy program, we try to do a couple of things that are a little bit different, I think, from what often happens on the rest of the Yale campus. The first of those is to bring different forms of knowledge together, so to build conversations between people who are primarily working within the academy, within universities, often historians, with people who are engaging those same sorts of questions from outside of the university setting, and have everybody sort of sit down together and try to hash some issues through. So we're going to have really a moderated conversation today. I'll be asking some questions up here, but it's going to be mostly a conversation between our two guests, and then we'll open it up for group discussion after about 45 minutes or so. So we try to, as I said, kind of combine different forms of knowledge around big questions, and that's really the second set of ideas behind this series, which is that often we are either focused very narrowly on particular forms of expertise that universities are very good at doing, people coming in to give talks about their area of research. And on the other hand, I think we're often sort of caught up in a very rapidly changing news cycle at the moment. And these conversations are really designed to step back a little bit from both of those and try to ask some really big questions in a broad historical perspective. In this case, of course, we're going to be talking about the sort of long history of American conservatism and where it's headed. And then the last thing that we like to try to do in these conversations is to think a little bit about the word strategy, which is to think about how political actors, in this case, the conservative movement, have set about changing American politics, political culture. Sometimes we deal with that in a foreign policy context. So really to ask questions of how it is that people have conceived of exerting influence, and in particular political influence in the world, and to think about what we all might learn from that ourselves. So that's my idea of what we're going to be doing in this conversation, but of course it will mostly be focused on what comes from our two distinguished guests, Kim Phillips-Fein and Max Boot. Let me just take a moment to introduce them and then to welcome them to the stage. Kim Phillips-Fein is a professor of history, American history at New York University, and she is the author of one of the true classics at this point in the history of American conservatism, a book called Invisible Hands, The Making of the Conservative Movement from the New Deal to Reagan. That book really looks particularly at the rise of organized business in politics, at the rise of free market ideas as they were shaped from the 1930s up to the 1980s. And while it has a real intellectual history component to it, it's also about the ways in which those ideas and those coalitions began to reshape American politics more broadly through coalitions that came to be known as the modern conservative movement. More recently, she is the author of Fear City, which is a book about the New York City fiscal crisis of the 1970s and the ways in which that moment began to shape sort of a new form of urban austerity politics in the United States. That book was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in history, and she has won many other awards and accolades over the year. She is also a prominent public historian who has written very widely for publications ranging from The Nation to The New Republic to Harper's Magazine on a wide array of topics. Max Boot is currently the Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow in International Security or in national security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also a historian, I should note, a Yale-trained historian, someone who spent 1 year here in the Yale History Graduate Program before deciding that he was going to actually leave the academy. I think we drove him out and on to maybe bigger and better things in some sense. After getting his master's degree in history, he moved into journalism, worked for several years at the Christian Science Monitor, and then as the op-ed editor of the Wall Street Journal for several years. Now, as I said, he is at the Council on Foreign Relations, and throughout this period of time, he's written several books, one of which the students in the Grand Strategy class have already encountered, which is Invisible Armies. It's a study of guerrilla warfare and terrorism in a very, very broad historical perspective. The book that we're going to spend some time talking about today is more recent. It's called The Corrosion of Conservatism: Why I Left the Right. So at this point, I think Max Boot is one of the country's most prominent never-Trumpers, someone who spent much of his life and formative intellectual and political experiences within the conservative movement, and since 2016 has left. And we can talk about whether he is still calling himself a conservative these days and exactly where he might fit into politics in this moment. I should note that he has also been widely engaged as a foreign policy analyst and as a political advisor, most notably to the McCain and Romney and Rubio presidential campaigns. And he's also worked a great deal in Iraq and Afghanistan as an advisor to various military figures, thinking about the role of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Military power in particular. So please join me in welcoming both Kim Phillips-Fein and Max Boot to the stage for what will be a fascinating conversation. All right, well, welcome. I thought it might be useful as we start this conversation about American conservatism to define a few terms in starting out, because I think the parameters of that title are not self-evident. So I wondered if we could maybe just start out with your reflections both on how you think about this term, conservatism, in the present, but also this category known as the conservative movement, and maybe offer a few reflections in starting out for the audience about where you're starting in thinking about those terms, their history, your own experiences in them. I thought maybe we'd start with you, Max.
Well, first, thanks for having me. Always great to be back at Yale, and I absolve Yale of any blame for the course that my life has taken, having only been here for a year, but it was a great year, and it forged some relationships and friendships that have lasted to this day. This is actually sort of a new thing for me to think about, even though I was, quote unquote, part of the conservative movement for, pretty much my whole adult life. Intellectually, I've been focused on other matters as a military historian, foreign policy wonk. So I did not in the past make the kind of intensive study of the conservative political movement, for example, that Kim has done. For me, it was kind of a thing that I lived rather than studied, but I don't think there's any real agreement on what American conservatism is all about. It's a fairly arbitrary term, and that in many parts of the world would actually be called classical liberalism, or at least let me step back, at least the kind of conservatism that I espoused, and to some extent still espouse, would be called classical liberalism in other parts of the world, because it's basically dedicated to enhancing individual liberty, and it believes in trying to minimize to the extent possible the role of the state, encouraging free enterprise, along, of course, with a healthy social safety net. In the American context, it's also a belief set that stood for strong defense, American leadership in the world, respect for kind of middle-class morality, as that morality has shifted over the years, suspicion of vast social engineering, suspicion that the government can remake society as a force for good. So again, largely what has been known elsewhere in the world as liberalism, in fact, is what has become known as conservatism. But I guess what's happened in the last few years, and I don't want to jump the gun on this story, but I think what's happened is that American conservatism is being redefined in terms very similar to the kind that you've seen in other parts of the world, where conservatism has really meant blood and soil ideology and essentially nativism and nationalism and true, conservatism in the sense of being really reactionary and hostile to immigrants, which, for example, the conservatism that I grew up with was not hostile to immigrants. Ronald Reagan, for example, was very welcoming of immigrants, and he was somebody who was president when I was growing up in the 1980s. And now I feel like President Trump and his followers are tapping into a different strain of American conservatism that was always, or at least not always, but generally a fairly marginal one that I associate with figures like Father Coughlin or John Calhoun, Charles Lindbergh, George Wallace, people that I view as being disreputable racists and reactionaries. And I feel like the modern conservative movement, as it developed in the 50s and 60s, was to some an attempt to define conservatism in a kind of different classical liberal kind of way, while it's still incorporating people who hold some of these belief systems. But I think what's happened now is that you've seen a redefinition of conservatism, so that it's really this kind of nationalist, populist, European-style conservative strain, which is becoming dominant in the United States. And people like me who still hew to a kind of classical liberal outlook on the world, I think are very much marginalized in the Republican Party, which is why I'm not a Republican anymore.
Great. Well, Kim Phillips-Fein, does that make sense as a description of the conservative movement?
Right. Well, it was actually interesting. Your remarks, they brought to mind a essay by Friedrich von Hayek in maybe 1958 or so called "Why I Am Not a Conservative" or something like that. And Hayek was an economist and who wrote the book "The Road to Serfdom." And who is, was cited by many later participants in the conservative movement as the kind of one of including by Reagan himself, as sort of one of the architects of their intellectual creed. And Hayek also really did not want to define himself as a conservative, not exactly for the same reasons, but as a sense that he also took the phrase classical liberal, or he actually wanted to be a Whig, but that never caught on with anybody. But thinking that conservative wasn't the right word because conservative connotes, an adherence to tradition, a shoring up of older hierarchies, a belief in kind of the stable, a desire to preserve the stable communities of the past. I mean, again, in a very, kind of idealistic sense, that was what the word conservative meant for him, and he wanted to associate himself more with the forces of capitalism, of modernity, of transformation, and spontaneity, and a faith in a sense of an open future. So anyway, just interesting that your comment kind of brought that to mind. I think the idea of kind of what is the conservative, what is conservatism is maybe a little different than what is the conservative movement. And I think the conservative movement in American politics is maybe it's interesting. We're maybe standing at a moment when that movement, you can kind of trace a clear arc that it followed, which is coming perhaps to an end, or at least a transformation so deep that it's not the same any longer. And I think the conservative movement, as we think of it, kind of has its roots, I would say, in the 1930s and the period afterward, and is kind of a reaction to the rise of liberalism and of a kind of the New Deal liberalism, not exactly classical liberalism, but kind of New Deal liberalism, and the idea of the idea of an expanded state, an expanded government, an expanded social safety net, that individual freedom and prosperity depends in some way on a preservation of material security through that, the rise of the labor movement at that time, and that, in a way, modern conservatism took shape in reaction to that, and the conservative movement grew out of a long moment of reaction to that in one way or another. And yeah, I think it's an interesting, I think many of those institutions and in certain ways the central creed is now coming into, under pressure. I mean, the conservative movement brought together, and kind of famously brought together, different strands. On the one hand, a faith in the free market, a kind of set of ideas about a strong religious or evangelical at certain points component to the movement, and also anti-communism, linking these together. And it's always had these these wings that were at odds with each other. How they have hung together is been of great interest and fascination through the years. And but I think at this point there's a way in which things are changing. I would agree, and the movement as it existed previously is I don't know, changing its shape. So.
Well, I'm interested that both of you sort of answered that question really through an assessment of ideas and intellectual life. One of the pieces of your book that was so interesting to me was the description of your own from a very young age. So I believe that you were, nerdily reading National Review at 12, something on this order.
Nobody would lie about that, right?
No one would brag about that unless it were true. And your description of a kind of intellectual awakening that took place through that kind of reading, through engagement with figures like Hayek, et cetera. And it seems to me that one of the things that conservatives, at least a certain form of conservative politics in the 70s and then the 80s, was very proud of, was having sort of become, and then the Republican Party itself, having become a party of ideas, right? There was a moment, I think many liberals and many leftists certainly disagreed with this, but in which the Republican Party was claiming that it was the party of ideas. The conservative movement, particularly a kind of elite intellectual conservative movement, prided itself on a certain form of deep intellectual engagement and intellectual combat. So I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit about sort of your own experiences in that, and then how we make sense of what's happened in this moment, which is not just that the politics have changed, but that I think the level of respect accorded to people who say learn about foreign policy or engage in these kind of broad intellectual endeavors seems to not have much of a place in conservatism in particular, but maybe in politics more broadly.
Well, I would say if you want to disprove the theory of evolution, all you have to do is look at the transformation of conservative communicators from William F. Buckley Jr. to Sean Hannity. I mean, that is, idiocracy in action. That is the dumbing down of America. And I came of age in the 1980s when my heroes, and again, revealing what a nerd I was and am, my heroes were folks like Bill Buckley and George Will, who were tremendously erudite and who espoused this very learned form of conservatism. And that was a moment, remember, when you had intellectuals like Gene Kirkpatrick and Bill Bennett and others serving in high positions in the Reagan administration. And that was briefly a moment when the Republican Party at least thought of itself as a party of ideas. And I was an undergrad at Berkeley, and one of the things that revolted me at Berkeley, so to speak, about the campus left was that I felt that they were intolerant of competing ideas. They didn't want to engage in debate. They wanted to bully. And I remember, I wrote a conservative column for the student newspaper, the Daily Californian. I remember I once got a bullet in the mail that had my name on it, literally had my name taped on it. So I was not cowed by that. I was, in fact, it kind of confirmed my view that the people on the other side were not interested in a real debate. They were just interested in intimidation. And sadly, I think what's happened in the years since, there's still a lot of people, I think, on the left who are not interested in debate, or interested in intimidation, want to shut down free speech. You've had some of those controversies here at Yale, but I think what's happened in the years since is that the biggest threat to free speech and the biggest enemy of rationality and free debate has become the Republican Party and the right wing in America. I hesitate to call it a conservative movement, but certainly the right wing, and I think this is something that really dates back to the 1990s. Actually, one of the most fateful decisions the Reagan administration made And I think in hindsight, one of the worst was the FCC decision to stop enforcing the Fairness Doctrine, which made it possible for the rise of Rush Limbaugh, Fox News Channel, and then of course at the same time you had the rise of Newt Gingrich and the bomb throwers in Congress. And I was very naive at the time, and I imagined that these were positive developments, that all these forces would spread conservative ideas, but in fact, they're not spreading conservatism. What they are spreading is this all-encompassing rage, this desire to attack, liberals with almost no positive agenda. But to the extent that they have one, it's actually kind of a nationalist, populist, racist, anti-immigrant type of agenda, harking back to some imagined paradise of the 1950s where white people ran the country, basically. And that's, to the extent that there's an ideological agenda, that's it. But most of the time, I'm giving him too much credit. If you look at what people like Tucker Carlson, my dear friend on Fox News Channel, says, I think that's kind of the underlying basis of what he says and does. But in fact, what he says and does is just a clown show. It's basically insults for the sake of insults. And, Donald Trump is in many ways the perfect personification of that kind of high decibel, low IQ form of conservatism, which is now the dominant political force in this country, where he is literally irrational. He doesn't make sense from sentence to sentence, but he channels this kind of rage of his followers. And of course, Fox News Channel with the Hannitys and Ingrahams and Tucker Carlsons and others, they do the same. And so it's really this hostility towards expertise, towards evidence, towards reason. The only thing that really counts is attitudes and name calling. And this is really the destruction, I think, of intellectual conservatism in America. And what makes this destruction final is that there are so few conservatives who are willing to stand up against these trends. And so many of my friends on the right have basically had their brains sucked out and replaced with Trumpian mush. They have become enablers of the worst trends in American life. And this has been shocking to me. Even people who purported to be intellectuals are now revealing themselves to be, nothing but camp followers who will justify any kind of excess or ideology in the name of seeking political power. So this is, to me, has been a very troubling development, which exposes some very uncomfortable truths about this movement that I was part of in the past. I do think that there were higher aspirations, and some people still try to keep to them. There is still a very small cadre of never Trump conservatives, but I think what's happened to the conservative movement intellectually and their rejection of science and reason. For example, when I just point out, hey guys, there's not really a global warming debate, okay, it's an established fact. You can argue about what to do about it. You can't really deny that it exists. And yet a huge portion of the Republican Party and the conservative movement does deny global warming, led of course by Donald Trump, who thinks it's a Chinese hoax. So this kind of really just irrationalism, which has taken root on the right, I think is deeply shocking to somebody like me who grew up in the 1980s when, as I said before, the Republican Party was purportedly the party of ideas.
So do you have reflections on this kind of narrative that there was this golden age of kind of Republican ideas that we've fallen off from, or are there places that we should look to in history that might help explain some of the forces that we're now seeing emerge? Are we at a moment of break?
Right, well, I guess I would say two things. So one is that, and I think actually, I think historians have been coming back to these questions as well from a different perspective. A lot of historians have written about the conservative movement and the development of the ideas, the institutions, the relationship with the Republican Party. But I think in recent years, there's been a desire to pull back and look at I think the conservative movement is sort of one strand of a much broader conservative or right-leaning or right-wing community or political community in American history. And so, and there have always been these, I think, there's been the Coughlins, the kind of presence of American Nazis and fascists during the 30s, McCarthyism, the massive resistance, the anti-abortion politics. There's a huge world of people who have been, whose politics have been animated more by this kind of rage than by the sort of the ideas of Hayek, for example. And so and by rage, by racism, by a desire to maintain various kinds of traditional hierarchies. And so it's a much broader universe in a way. And the conservative movement, has a relationship to this. And I think actually it's not, a lot of the histories of the right have focused, for example, on the moment when William F. Buckley in the National Review distances itself from the American Mercury, which was an anti-Semitic publication in the 50s, or the moment when Buckley, kind of writes out the John Birch Society. But a lot of historians have focused on those moments as kind of a break between the respectable right and the sort of the right-wing crazies out there or something like that. But in fact, I think a lot of, there's just been is what matters that there was that break, or does it matter that there were, tens of thousands of people who were supporters of the John Birch Society and that their activism then helps to propel the Goldwater campaign in 1960 and then again in 1964. And so where do you place the emphasis? Is it more on the mainstreaming of the movement, or is it on the existence of this broader universe of people, the kind of the unrespectable right or something like that, whose ideas and attitudes may not be, also are not just contained to movement participants or activists, but actually ramify outward into the broader population in different ways. And so I think that's one way of looking at it. I think another, I think there is also, I guess my work, which has partly been on these business conservatives, is a different lineage for Trumpism, or that there's another, I would say there are ways in which Trump's politics, they in certain ways they break from precepts of movement conservatism around free trade, for example. But in other ways, they actually build on themes that were long present, and not even getting to the anti-immigrant politics, which we can talk about more, but just things like the kind of veneration of private enterprise, or the veneration of the figure of the businessman, and the sense that, that the private sector is sort of automatically and reflexively better than the public sector, and the kind of anti-tax politics, and that there's certain ways in which Trump's own somewhat ridiculous celebration of himself as a genius of business, a genius businessman and executive, it taps into this this set of ideas that are connected to things that have been long promoted by parts of the conservative movement, and also by the ways in which that movement has grown out of business support. So I think that it's not, I think it's while there are ways in which Trump does, has rejected the traditional conservative movement institutions and parts of the ideology, there are other ways in which he, builds on and is kind of made possible by this long history. So anyway,
If I could just pick up on a point that Kim just made, I think there's a lot of truth in that, and I think what you're getting at is that I think people like me who are part of the conservative movement tended to think that the conservative movement was the whole of the American right, by which we meant, of course, the conservative intellectual movement, the work that folks like me were doing at the American Enterprise Institute or what have you, National Review, et cetera. And I think what you're right, I think this is really maybe an obvious point, but one that I really had not been brought home to me until Trump's election, which was to understand how divorced, conservative intellectuals were from the actual concerns of most people who identify with conservatism or the Republican Party, because, I feel like basically a lot of what liberals have been saying for a long time is that a lot of people are voting for the Republican Party because they're racist and they want to see a racist agenda. And that was something that I resisted for a long time, because I would say, hey, I'm not a racist. My friends aren't racist. What are you talking about? And, we've gone from the Republican Party, dog whistling to racist to wolf whistling. And I mean, the appeal is just so clear and overwhelming in Trump's case that I really can't deny the reality. And what this is making me realize is that, I really did not understand the Republican electorate, because I thought that they actually liked conservative principles. But I think what the 2016 election shows, and the way, that Trump ran the 2018 election, is that for a lot of people, the racism was really, and the xenophobia was really what they were looking for. And in some ways, Trump is a truer expression of the American right than people like, John McCain or Mitt Romney, which is why I think a lot of the reason why there's actually much more enthusiasm in the Republican ranks for Trump than there is in many ways for people like McCain and Romney, who, whatever you may think of their politics, were good people, are good people.
Well, it makes me sort of thinking historically, going back to a moment like the 1964 election, which is a moment when Barry Goldwater's campaigns were the first identifiably conservative candidate runs on the Republican ticket, someone who's a proud conservative who considers himself, to the degree that this was the terminology of that moment, a kind of movement conservative. We have one story that is about this new sort of free market, libertarian coalition that's beginning to build, that is movement conservatism. Of course, the other thing that happens in 1964 is that the states that go for Barry Goldwater are the states of the Deep South, right? Nobody else in his home state. Nobody else votes for Barry Goldwater. So there's been an electoral coalition that has been built over many, many decades that has seemed to me always to be something of an uneasy electoral coalition, maybe an electoral coalition that was organized around a kind of anti-statist politics that people could come into from various perspectives. So if you are anti-civil rights, you're sort of focused on restraining federal power in that way, particularly around questions of race. If you're a business conservative, you're concerned with restraining the regulatory state. If you're an ideological libertarian, you have your own ideas about that. If you're a religious conservative, again, sort of you're focused on keeping the federal government out of local public schools, resisting sort of federal Supreme Court decisions. So this has been, I guess, what I'm saying is it seems like this has been an uneasy coalition for a very long time. It maybe had a certain organizing logic, particularly in the Cold War, but maybe even since then. And I guess my big question is, are we at a moment when that is breaking down? Are we about to see some realignment of the political parties and the kind of political coalitions that have operated in the United States? I guess it's kind of a question of what happens to the Max Boots of the world now in terms of institutional and party politics.
Both of us, or all 10 of us.
But are we at an actual realignment moment? Are we seeing parties become fundamentally identified differently than they have been sort of, I guess, since really the 1960s, certainly the 1970s? I don't know, maybe Kim, you want to start on that?
I guess I would actually just dial back for 1 minute just to what you were saying about the 1964 election. And I guess this is another, and I would actually be curious, Max, to hear your thoughts about this or about the 1964 election and Goldwater in particular. But I think it just is so hard. I think it's always very hard in the history, right, to prize these things apart. Because Goldwater, here we have this candidate, conscious of a conservative, his 1960 book, ghostwritten by William F. Buckley's brother-in-law. But the book is nonetheless, it's Goldwater identifies, it's his book. And it's this hit on college campuses. It both kind of helps to build. The idea of the book was actually originally financed by business people who were going to sell it to their, to buy it en masse and give it to their managers and workers. But it becomes a hit on college campuses as well. And the book both is on the one hand, it is, it's this impact. The statement of it is meant to be kind of taking conservatism away from being a politics of privilege to one of conscience. And the introduction to the book is very defensive about this, or kind of saying it's not, people have said conservatives are the politics of the rich, but actually this is a moral, principled position. And it stands for, it's about freedom. It's a politics of freedom, of liberation. In some ways, kind of taking the language and promises of the left and associating them with being a conservative. So which is the project of the book. At the same time, a big part of that book is about states' rights. It expresses Goldwater's opposition to Brown versus Board of Education, his sense that any kind of action on the part of the federal government to desegregate schools is kind of overstepping the constitutional bounds. He personally is not opposed to integration, but he is opposed to, and he expresses opposition to, any kind of national civil rights law, which is then how he'll vote in later years, as well as to Brown. And so from the outset, it's this politics which is pretty explicit about appealing to people who don't want to do anything to oppose Southern segregation. And that's part of how that electoral coalition is built. Those are the states that go for Goldwater. And I think that, so, and there are other ways in which you could look at this connection between the kind of politics of race and racism and the ideas about the free market. But I think even in Goldwater's, and then in that actual campaign, one of the Goldwater winds up running, a certain amount of the rhetoric of individualism gives way to a discussion of law and order in the context of 1964 and the kind of uprisings of that year and the growing civil rights movement. The discussion of law and order is very clearly about black protest and finding ways to shut it down. And so I just think there's these politics have always been joined more deeply. So I think the question, are we at a realignment point? What is going to happen? I mean, I think it's, as a historian, it's, projecting the future. I think there are a lot of ways in which, though, it does seem, I think, yeah, this is not just the Republican Party. Also, there's the story of what's happening within the Democratic Party and all the struggles taking place there. So I think this is not an accident that this would be a moment of reckoning and kind of and thinking about the future. I think nobody is really sure what will happen, and as a historian too, it's it's a kind of really sharp readjustment. It's harder, I think, to write about the right than it was for me when I started down this path, many years ago.
I mean,
So what's going to happen to the Max Boots of the world?
Well, just to back up a second, I mean, I agree with what Kim said about the Goldwater and the '64 election, and that was really, I write about that in my book, The Corrosion of Conservatism, and I managed to alienate a lot of conservatives and Republicans because, I don't look at Trump as being this strange creature who came out of nowhere to take over the Republican Party. I do think what he's doing and saying does have real roots in the Republican Party, although again, I don't think it's defined the totality of the Republican Party, but it has been a significant strain. And I do go back in the book to '64 and say that was really the moment when the Republican Party went from being the party of Lincoln to being the party of the segregationists. And that actually prefigured the Richard Nixon Southern strategy. In a lot of ways, Republicans would prefer to put it on Nixon and his Southern strategy because Nixon, as we know, was kind of an immoral, disreputable figure. But no, in fact, this actually started with Barry Goldwater, who remains today an icon of American conservatism. Now, I think what makes it a little more complicated is the fact that I don't actually think, and I'm ready to be corrected, but as far as I know, I don't actually think Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan, who rose to political fame supporting Barry Goldwater with the speech in 1964, I don't think Reagan and Goldwater were actually racist. I mean, Goldwater was somebody who actually integrated the Arizona National Guard. Reagan always told the story about how he had, black classmates who were on the football team at Eureka College and how he took them into his own home and they would not be allowed to stay at a segregated hotel. And just reading like Reagan's correspondence and so forth and writings, I don't really see any evidence of explicit racism, but I do think that ever since 1964, Republicans have been flirting with racism and often using kind of the dog whistle terminology about states' rights, welfare queens, law and order, that kind of stuff. And I think to some extent, I would say largely my sense is that people like Goldwater and Reagan probably did so somewhat innocently because they actually believed in states' rights. They actually believed in limiting the role of the federal government because they believed in private enterprise and so forth. But I think there was also a much more explicitly racial wing of Southerners, really people like Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms. Clearly, they knew what they were doing. For them, this was all about race and keeping African Americans down. And I think they basically formed an unholy alliance, and that's what made possible the rise of the modern Republican Party, which in many ways you could argue, I mean, oversimplification, but kind of an alliance between Midwestern isolationists and Southern segregationists. And then on top, kind of the whipped cream atop the sundae, there was a small amount of intellectual stuff that people like me or Bill Buckley or others generated. But I think this was, you know, to use kind of Marxist terminology, this was, you know, this was the kind of the structure upon which the party was constructed. And obviously, as Kim points out, there was also a lot of business interests with money favoring deregulation and so forth. But in terms of coming back to, you know, your question about where do we go from here, is there a realignment? I think there is a potential realigning moment. You saw that in 2018 when you had Republican suburbs across the country voting for Democratic candidates, and Republicans lost 40 seats in the House because they really lost the center-right voters, especially women, in all these suburban districts. And now, staggering to see that Orange County, the hotbed of conservatism, now has an entirely Democratic representation in Congress for the first time, you know, since the 1930s or something like that. So, you know, something is clearly going on here. I think there's an opportunity here, and I hope, my fear is that, you know, as Abba Eban said of the Palestinians, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I fear that Democrats never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, although I think that they were actually pretty smart in 2018, and I hope that they will be smart going forward, and that they will choose somebody who is reasonably centrist, i.e. not Bernie, somebody who can actually appeal to the great middle and bring over all these disaffected middle-of-the-road independents and some former Republicans like me who can't stand the direction of the Republican Party. I think there is the potential for a massive realigning election right now if Democrats can pull that off, but obviously too soon to say if that's actually going to happen.
Well, I want to give you a chance to reflect on some of that, but I also want to look back and think about in this moment, right? So there are realignments in politics and big structural forces that are often at play, demographics, the economy, but then there's also strategy. There are people who set out deliberately to kind of remake the political landscape. And so I wonder if you have reflections on kind of conservatism as a movement, which took what many people have described this period from the 30s through, say, the 1970s as kind of the great age of liberalism in American politics, and then proceeded to, I think, quite self-consciously transform where political power sat, transform what the American political culture was like. So are there lessons to be learned from that? Sort of how did that happen? Is it just big structural forces? Are there moments of strategy and kind of deliberate intervention that would be useful to think about no matter where you are on the political spectrum right now?
Yeah, well, I think yes, there were. I think, and I think that there. I think it's actually it's the conservative mobilization has a. There were many ways in which I think conservative activists were very self-conscious about strategy, and particularly, and you know, this may sound more, it may sound more, I don't know, Machiavellian or something than I intended to, but I think the way in which I know Machiavelli is a grand strategy figure, but there's a way in which I think that a lot of conservative activists were very self-aware about building a movement that they felt was not the movement of the majority, or that they were building a politics, especially actually in this kind of moment in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that they were aware, or that they thought was not one that the kind of the broad population of the country was easily or automatically drawn to. And so there was a strong effort or strong interest in finding ways to, they might have had a sense that, if people only really understood what we were up to, of course they would come along and agree, but also a sense that what they were doing was a minority mobilization at the time, and they had to find a way to win adherents and converts. And I guess there are a couple of, so there's a very deep interest actually in building a politics of ideas. And I think the idea of the right as a place of ideas is not an accident. I think there was actually a lot of effort, energy, and intensity put into building intellectual institutions and funding and sort of creating a conservative intellectual network. And you see this both in of course, you see this in law schools through the Federalist Society. You see it in the networks of think tanks and all the different kinds of think tanks and sort of the efforts to bring young people into those and summer programs and institutes. There's a whole world of kind of generating an intellectual infrastructure for the right. There's also a kind of effort to counter to try to build sort of to counter liberal-leaning institutions like labor unions, or to kind of campaign against them actively in the workplace in different ways. So again, kind of creating this sense of a groundswell or to sort of attack these institutions at the root. The interest in the courts also, an effort to find a way to influence policy, but without actually having to build a majority in support of the mobilization. So I think I think these kinds of efforts are actually quite strategic, quite careful, and quite they involve a level of conscious planning. I do actually think that there is a way in which movements of the left are kind of have a certain kind of structural difference, or that politics that are based in one way or another in kind of challenging society as it is, or tradition, or sort of social hierarchies as they are, that those politics are harder to craft, and you can't really do them simply from above. They demand a kind of effort to mobilize the broad mass of the citizenry, the population, and bring them into political life in one way or another. And there is no other basis for their strength over time. So while I think there's a lot of elements of kind of building ideas and creating more intellectual networks, and those matter, but at the heart, I think there is a kind of structural difference in how these mobilizations can hope to be victorious. And I think, or hope victorious is too simple, but to hope to change things in the future, hope to build a different kind of future. And I guess I would say that something of the same is true today. So.
Well, I wonder if you want to take that up and maybe also bring in a subject, and this will be my last question, then we'll open it up to the floor. Also think about where your foreign policy work sort of fits into anything. We've had a very domestic politics-focused discussion here. So either thinking about strategy or just thinking about the ways in which, sort of in your own experience, those two realms have interacted, and are we seeing a divergence between kind of domestic and foreign policy now, or are we seeing them both move in a dramatically new direction?
Well, I think what the Trumpian ascendancy is revealing is, I think, how unimportant so much of this intellectual work that was done by the conservative movement in the past actually was. And I think there was a tendency to exaggerate its importance, in part by people like me who are actually doing this work, but also by people on the left who said, oh, look at all these people on the right, they're doing all this, they're funding all these think tanks, they're doing all this thinking, we got to do the same thing. And at the end of the day, I think, the only thing that really matters is kind of this brute struggle. I mean, I'm exaggerating, it's kind of this brute struggle for power. It's not the only thing that matters, but it matters more, I think, in many ways than most of the ideas, because, I think what you're seeing is, you're seeing the Republican Party losing any allegiance to most of the ideas that supposedly define the Republican Party in the modern era. This is supposedly the party of law and order, which supports a president who daily attacks the FBI and the Justice Department. This is supposedly the party of free trade, who supports a president who has launched trade wars with every American trading partner. This is supposedly the party of fiscal responsibility that supports a president who has added $2 trillion in debt since he came into office. This is supposedly the party of traditional morality that supports a president who pays off his porn star mistress and a Playboy playmate. So anything that I would recognize as being traditional, almost anything I would recognize, the key word is almost, anything that I would recognize as traditional conservatism has been happily jettisoned in this pell-mell rush to seize power. The only two things that really remain, I would say, of the traditional, I would add also, you raised the issue of foreign policy, and also, of course, the Republican commitment, supposed American commitment to American global leadership and defense, has been jettisoned to support a president who regularly trashes our allies and kisses up to our enemies. I mean, I came of age when Ronald Reagan was saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So it's disorienting to me to see a Republican president who is now saying, Mr. Putin is very strong and convincing in his denials. That's quite a change. And so all these traditional Republican ideas have been jettisoned. And so what's left? I think basically two things. One, a commitment to lower taxes no matter what, and a commitment to appoint right-wing judges. And the reason why right-wing judges are important is because that is basically how the evangelicals think they are going to outlaw abortion and gay marriage. And they claim to believe in constitutionalism. Of course, they do no such thing. And you've seen the shocking spectacle in the last week or so in the House, only 13 Republicans voted to overturn Donald Trump's unconstitutional state of emergency to appropriate money that has not been actually voted by Congress. And that's as clear a violation of the Constitution as you can imagine. And yet the party of constitutional conservatism has endorsed that, and they will endorse it in the Senate as well. And yet they want to see conservative judges because they're not interested in the Constitution. What they're interested in is basically the very thing that they accuse liberals of doing, which is legislating their agenda from the bench. So yes, they want to legislate their social agenda from the bench, and they want to cut taxes. And cutting, really a sign of how brain dead the Republican Party is that it has become the party of cutting taxes no matter what, and no matter what the circumstances. Ronald Reagan actually cut taxes in 1981, and it made sense because it was basically Keynesian stimulus for the economy in the midst of a deep recession. But now Republicans cut taxes in 2017, even though the economy was booming, and this was only going to be a temporary stimulus that would then saddle us with huge deficit spending for decades to come, and that has in fact happened. But nevertheless, they support that because that is something that basically the donors to the Republican Party want to see, and the judges is something that the evangelical base of the Republican Party would like to see. So out of all the ideas the Republican Party has championed over the decades, it turns out those are the taxes and judges are the only two that actually matter to the Republican Party. And those are not the ideas, obviously, that I've associated my career with.
I want to give a chance to have some questions from the floor. We have a microphone, yes? Okay, so just raise your hand and the microphone will come around. And please just introduce yourself very briefly when you ask your question. All right, we'll start out right here, center.
Hi, I'm Peter Sleskin, a predoctoral fellow at ISS here. This is a question for Max Boot. When you described at the beginning the kind of conservatism that you espoused, you said that you were suspicious of the federal government acting as a force for good in the US. So I wonder if that's so, we should be equally suspicious of the federal government acting as a force for good abroad.
So what was the last part?
Whether we should also be suspicious of the federal government or of the United States more broadly acting as a force for good in the world. Suspicious of it acting.
Yeah, I mean, I think you certainly need some skepticism of government action, whether at home or abroad. And I write in the book about the fact that, for example, I regret my support for the Iraq War, and I had, I think, an exaggerated sense of what the U.S. could achieve in Iraq in terms of transforming that country. And I'm still very much a hawk, and I'm still very much a believer in American global leadership, but I am somewhat chastened, and the Iraq War certainly brought home to me the inadvisability of preventative conflicts and also the limits of military action. Nevertheless, I still believe, and this is one thing that I have not changed my view on, I think that the United States overall, despite many stumbles from Vietnam to Iraq, I nevertheless believe that the United States has been the greatest force for good in the world in the last century, and that the system that was created after World War II by the greatest generation, based on free trade and American support for alliances and democracy, I think is very much in our interest as well as in the interest of the rest of the world, except of course for the despots and tyrants out there. And I think it is very much in our interest to keep promoting that international system in league with our allies. And so I think that, you know, what Trump is doing in coddling dictators like Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, and at the same time constantly attacking allies, whether the leaders of Canada or Britain or Germany or what have you, I think is highly corrosive to the Pax Americana that was created after 1945. And I do believe that with all the stumbles and all the mistakes that we've made, and God knows we've made a lot of them, I think American dominance of the international system is far preferable to the alternatives, which are going to be either Chinese dominance or a sheer state of anarchy and multipolarity that I think will be extremely dangerous and will could easily wind up recreating the pre-1914 conditions that led to a war, a global war, except on a much more dangerous scale now with the prevalence of the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Can I throw this to you as well, Kim, to maybe talk about the historian's perspective? So we've talked a lot about conservatism. We haven't talked about the category of neoconservatism as much, and sort of the relationship between neoconservatism and the decision to go to war in Iraq. I mean, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I want to hear some of your reflections about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I myself have actually always had a certain discomfort with the word neoconservative in particular, or rather, I guess I understand it. You know, the first neoconservatives, the people in the 1970s who kind of rejected actually parts of the free market, laissez-faire thinking of the right, but wanted to kind of reassert both a very idealistic anti-communist foreign policy, especially in the wake of the Vietnam War, and also kind of the new social conservatism. And saw an alliance with a certain kind of tempered enthusiasm for the free market as part of that, but tried to set themselves apart from an earlier right. I mean, I think that the Iraq War, though, and the idea, in the Iraq War, the word neoconservative, the idea of the neoconservative, were people who who saw the Iraq War and saw the conflict, or saw the possibility of deposing Hussein as a chance to establish democracy in the Middle East, and described the foreign policy in this kind of very idealistic, very far-reaching terms. And I think, and there's a kind of group of people who put that forward. It wasn't all of the Bush administration or everybody who supported that war, which was of course very popular at the time, or had, despite also having, large popular mobilizations against the war, and a critique of the war, and of the entrance into the war, at that moment as well. I think one interesting, but still, I think there's something about, it's not exactly this, I'm never crazy about the term neoconservative. It got lobbied around a lot as a term of insult at that moment without that much precision about who was or wasn't part of it. What I do think is interesting, though, is I think that the Iraq War, and we haven't really talked that much tonight yet, really, about why, what is the, if Trump doesn't come out of the conservative movement, where does he come from? Or where is this support for, what is this about? Is it just a kind of reaction to, some sort of inherent, free-floating racism within the American public? Or where does this come from? Why is it happening now? And I do think that the Iraq War actually is an important part of that story, and kind of understanding what the kind of Trump's appeal as a critic of the Iraq War and as a, the kind of the disproportionate burdens of the costs of the war and the kind of the frustrations of fighting the war, being displaced towards other borders that seem more controllable. I think there is a kind of, there's a relationship between the Iraq War and the success of Trump and the emergence of Trumpism. And so I think that's another, part of the kind of how we got where we are now.
Great. Other question? Down here.
So thank you so much. I study really the fracturing of the Republican Party around the women's issue in the 1970s. And kind of recently I was watching a 76 speech from Phyllis Schlafly endorsing Reagan, in which he talks about the need to exit the SALT Treaty because Soviet Union's violating it, and the U.S. needs to rearm, therefore, condemning Ford for the terrible trade deals that have caused the massive loss of jobs overseas, and even talking about how America is being taken over by gangs which are raping and murdering Americans in the thousands. So kind of my question is to you, how do we fit Phyllis Schlafly and Stop ERA into the lineage of American conservatism? And as Trump, in some ways, the culmination of this kind of American conservatism?
I mean, I actually, for the first time in my life last year, while I was writing this book on the corrosion of conservatism, I actually read Phyllis Schlafly's tract, A Choice Not an Echo, which sold millions of copies. And lo and behold, in there I found an echo of Trumpism from the 1960s. I mean, it's actually uncanny because this book was utterly unhinged. It was basically suggesting that there was a conspiracy of East Coast financiers who were dominating the Republican Party and were consciously causing the Republican Party to lose presidential elections. Because remember, this was written in the mid '60s after, the loss in 1964, the loss in 1960, and then going prior to that, the losses to Harry Truman and FDR. And so, aside from Eisenhower, who she did not consider a real conservative, conservatism had been having a pretty rough patch in national politics. And instead of saying, oh, well, maybe the Republican Party was putting up unattractive candidates or espousing unpopular views, Phyllis Schlafly's position was no. This was an active plot by these East Coast, this cabal of East Coast figures who had seized control of the Republican Party and were trying to cause it deliberately to lose because they were in league with Moscow and wanted to bring communism to America. That's as crazy as it sounds, but this was actually what she believed and what she said. And so it's kind of gobsmacking to think that with these views, she became an icon of conservatism in the 1970s, albeit in a somewhat different context, opposing the ERA. But nevertheless, she had these insane views, and they obviously echoed, so to speak, with many conservatives who read her tract approvingly. And I really see a straight line from people like Phyllis Schlafly to the kind of off-the-rails conspiratorial thinking that Donald Trump espouses. I mean, it's a very short distance from what Phyllis Schlafly was saying in the 60s to, Donald Trump's suggestion that the people who have run America prior to his ascendance didn't really love America, and they were deliberately running us down and selling us out to the globalists and Wall Street banks and people like George Soros, who was supposedly behind the caravans. I mean, all this kind of insanity which taps into these long-term populist strains in American thinking, deeply suspicious of East Coast elites, of bankers, of Jews, of intellectuals, and they tend to link all those groups that they hate together into one big conspiracy that's oppressing the real Americans, i.e. people like them. And so I think that is a continuing strain on the American right, which was not part of intellectual conservatism as I understood it, but which I think has actually been in many ways a much more powerful strain electorally on the right than the actual views of people like me.
I would just add that I think Schlafly imported part of that into her anti-feminism also, or she also saw, it certainly, she saw feminism as the product of a small cabal of liberal elite intellectuals as well, and even occasionally kind of implied that it was connected to communism. And so, she had a consistent worldview. But yes, it's definitely nice to see her as a foreign policy activist first, who then came to anti-feminism almost opportunistic, or she kind of saw it as a new cause to affiliate herself with. But she had a strong political identity first.
And I would add, by the way, I applaud Kim for being suspicious of the term neoconservatism, which I think has become largely devoid of meaning, but it is sometimes used, I think, actually in that kind of conspiratorial, anti-Semitic context that you see, conspiracy mongering about George Soros and other figures. And I think, the talk about the neocons, I mean, there's some legitimate things you can say, but I think it also became kind of a shorthand for both the far left and the far right, tapping into this notion that there was this cabal of Jews who are running American foreign policy. And I think that's one of the reasons why you need to be careful about using the term.
Down here.
Thank you, Ryan. You said earlier that you don't think Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan were overt racists, or that they were racist kind of in any real sense of the term. But you also acknowledged that over at least the last 50 years, the Republican Party has overwhelmingly come down on the side against civil rights and against a lot of what many people would say are policies that are pro-racial equality, that are in favor of equality and economic justice, and a lot of things and diversity generally. And I think a lot of people would have said before the 2016 election that there was some kind of reckoning coming with the Republican Party, with its general lack of diversity, with this history of dog whistling or wolf whistling to racists, and that at some point there had to be a reckoning with that identity if conservative ideas disassociated from that practical legacy had to continue. And yet in 2016, as you said, if anything, the dog whistling turned into wolf whistling. So do you think that reckoning is still coming, and that at some point Republicans and the Republican Party generally will have to deal with this kind of racial tension and racial history within the party? And if so, how do you think that will play out? Do you think there will be new parties, divisions? What do you envision for that?
Yes, I think winter is coming. I think that, although sitting here on this frigid March day, it feels like winter is already here. But no, I think what happened in the past is that Republican candidates kind of dog whistle to racism at election time. But by and large, when you look at the actual Republican presidents or leaders, they did not do that much to advance this xenophobic, racist agenda. And I think that caused some tension within the party, because I think there was huge frustration that Republicans would kind of show a little leg to racists. And for example, even George H.W. Bush, who was fundamentally a very decent, good person, nevertheless, with the Willie Horton ad in 1988, kind of appealed to racists. And then, of course, they were sorely disappointed when he didn't actually do anything to advance a racist agenda, because lo and behold, he wasn't actually a racist. And so I think in some ways Donald Trump has kind of closed the gap between Republican campaigning and Republican governance, because in office he's actually as racist, or even more so, than any previous Republican candidate was on the campaign trail. And so this is part of the rapturous reaction that he has received from a large part of the Republican base. And I think in some ways he is a genius, an evil genius, but he is a genius because, he turned kind of conventional wisdom on its head. After 2012, the conventional wisdom was that Republicans had to appeal to minorities. And he basically said, no, instead of appealing to minorities, I'm going to double down on white people, and I'm going to mobilize these angry old white people who watch Fox News. And lo and behold, that turned out to be a winning strategy, at least in electoral college votes, if not in popular vote terms. But at the end of the day, this is not going to succeed for the Republican Party, because by the 2040s, we are going to be a majority-minority country, and the Republican Party is increasingly identified with a shrinking percentage of the population that is white. And what I predict will happen to the National Republican Party is what happened to the Republican Party in my home state of California, where in the 1990s under Pete Wilson, the California Republican Party became identified with opposition to immigration, as a result of which, in the changing demographics of California, the growing Latino population, the Republican Party has been wiped out in California. There's not a single statewide office holder, and out of the entire congressional delegation of something like 56 Congress people, I think there's like 7 Republicans, something like that, tiny minority. And so I think this is the fate that awaits the Republican Party on this Trumpian course, but that doesn't mean that Trump can't conceivably squeeze out another victory with his angry old white people base in 2020. And of course, by the time the Republican Party is destroyed at some point in the future, Trump is going to be gone from office, and what does he care? He's not a really Republican anyway.
Actually, I just would add one thing to that, which is I do think that it's how to put this. I just think that there's something tricky about sort of just referring to the Trump's popularity solely or completely in terms of his sort of the racist appeal, or there is like a kind of group of people who are the defined racists in American history, and sort of it's competing. I just am not sure that that's quite the right framework, and I think in some ways these, so for example, or just thinking about where these policies, where these politics come from, or thinking about the Reagan administration. On the one hand, Reagan with immigration, there are these very idealistic sort of sweeping statements about immigration. At the same time, it's also during the Reagan years that you start to see the militarization of the border in a new way with the drug war. You start to see the emergence of you see the revival of a rhetoric of a crisis of immigration, especially with regard to the Cuban, the Mariel boat lift, and the sense of there being a Haitian, or an emergency of Haitian immigrants who are then kind of a policy of intercepting Haitian immigrants at sea. So there's and that's also when you start to see the growth of detention as a policy for people in the country illegally. And so I think it's it's not, there's just a kind of deeper reservoir for these policies. It's not just, kind of and reckoning with them doesn't just mean sort of confronting overt statements of racism or of prejudice, but it means grappling with a whole, a kind of a policy framework too, that is then the basis out of which these ideas emerge. So and take hold and become, kind of meaningful parts of people's lived reality. So anyway, I just think it's a larger, I would just kind of, I think you have to expand the framework somewhat.
Great. I think we have time. If there are a last couple of questions we can bundle together and then get some reflections up here. We'll take this one down here if there's anyone else, and over there as well. Okay, we'll do these three.
Thank you. I wonder if you think there was any hope for me. I continue to be, and I know this shouldn't be a political discussion, and I'm taking the risk of being close to it. I've been a registered Republican for the last 50 years. In my age of 88 years, I graduated from Yale in 1953. And I tell my friends, who are all Democrats because they're more fun, and I like a lot of their attitudes, that the reason I'm a registered Republican is hoping that I can bring the Republican Party back to its senses, and that I want fiscal conservatism, which is compatible with being progressive in terms of civic matters. Is there any hope for me?
There's always hope. Yes. Yes. Well, no, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I guess if we were having a longer conversation, I would want to know what, kind of what you associate with fiscal responsibility. What does it mean to be fiscally responsible? No deficits at its heart. Well, certainly, I mean, I don't know, I'm not sure what you'll do in terms of your, who you'll vote for, but I think that the politics, I also, I mean, I wouldn't, I don't,
I'm not asking you.
right, yeah, but I think that the, the deficit, I agree that that people have to think about where the money to pay for social programs will come from and what it means to have. I mean, I guess I would maybe draw the lines differently, but I think that the basic principle of funding that you have to be able to fund the social programs that you want to see exist is an important one. And I don't think I think that people who want to see a broader social safety net, a broader welfare state, a broader distribution of social resources have to think about where that will come from. So it's not, I don't think you can do that out of thin air or magic or simply by running a deficit forever and ever. So I think I think it's an important question, and I think it's I don't know what you'll do in terms of who to vote for or how to handle those questions, but
Well, just a second. How do I convince them that it's fun to be frugal?
Oh, well, have good parties. And again, I don't know if I would entirely agree about frugality per se.
Let me get
yeah.
these last, there's the last question over here. And was there, okay, we'll take this, let's bundle them together, get all three questions over there, here, and then down front, and then we'll get some final thoughts and wrap up.
Okay.
So don't answer until we've heard all the questions.
I'll be brief. Jean-François Bélanger, I'm a postdoc here with ISS. And I want to come back to the very first question that we had, which to me was really a question about American conservative interest in force projection by the Americans. The American government and its desire not to have this force being checked. I'm referring, this question's for Matt. Please, I'd like to have your thoughts on this. On your numerous columns that you have on North Korea, I work myself on nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. And I'm curious as to where we could go. So when I read you, what I read is we need to go back to maximum sanction, what we've done before, to try and get them to fold. But it seems that on the other side of the aisle is an immutable force that is very cognizant of what happened to the Gaddafi and Hussein of this world and have absolutely no desire to denuclearize. And it seems that the system U.S. Desire to get them to denuclearize is one of force projection layered into threat management. And my question out of all of this is, what's wrong with deterrence? Why can we stop dealing with North Korea as a non-proliferation question and turn to this as an arms control question and really try to settle the problem once for all? Or is American force projections calculation makes it impossible to flip the question the way that I propose?
Okay, great. We have a question here as well.
Hi, Emily Whalen. I'm a pre-doc at ISS. Really light topic. I wanted to return to the question of anti-Semitism and support for Israel, because it seems that this is an issue that sort of transcends the parsing between the sort of intellectual never-Trumpers and the very anti-Semitic pro-Trumpers, which is generally both tend to land on the side of supporting Israel. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the way that the relationship between the United States and Israel kind of moves forward on the sort of conservative side of things. Thanks.
Okay, then down here.
I wanted to direct my question specifically to Mr. Boot. I wanted to ask about your comments on what commentators call the liberal international order, like the system set up post-45 and crystallized after the Cold War, because you said that you believed that this was the best system with the US at its helm, but right now we're seeing a lot of emerging illiberal powers making assertive inroads around the world, and so I'm wondering if you see the best strategy for American foreign policy to be doubling down on being this proactive global power, maintaining its, I guess, hegemony, or if you see a better, if given the current context of where we see ourselves in the liberal international order, do you see an alternative foreign policy as being better?
Well, why don't you start out with the specific questions? They were mostly directed to you, and then we'll give you a chance for a few final thoughts too.
Okay, a lot of things to consider. Okay, North Korea, Donald Trump is clearly laboring under some elaborate delusion if he thinks that Kim Jong-un is in love with him or is going to give up his nuclear weapons. Not going to happen. The U.S. intelligence community is right. He's not going to give up the nuclear weapons. The reason, I think, we don't have a lot of good options in North Korea. If we continue having summits with him, legitimating him, undercutting sanctions as Trump is doing, calling the U.S.-South Korea alliance into question by canceling military exercises, we are basically empowering Kim Jong-un, even as he continues to build more nuclear weapons, even as he continues to build more ballistic missiles. I think the policy of maximal pressure in sanctions is very recent. It was really only applied in 2016, 2017, and clearly the North Koreans don't like it because they're desperate for those sanctions to be lifted. So I don't mind talking to the North Koreans, but I don't believe in making unilateral concessions when they're not willing to even freeze their nuclear program, which they clearly are not at this point. So I think we just need to continue with the policy of maximum pressure as well as with deterrence. I mean, remember that deterrence worked with the Soviet Union for decades, and they had a lot more nuclear weapons than North Korea does. I don't think that North Korea is going to attack us or South Korea with nuclear weapons as long as we have 28,000 American troops there, as long as we have the American nuclear umbrella. So pressure and deterrence, I think, they're not like a magic solution. They're not going to make the North Korean problem go away, but I think that's the best way to manage the problem. Then we had another question here about the U.S. relationship with Israel. And, you know, it's kind of bizarre because Donald Trump appeals, you know, he says that, you know, white supremacists are good people, and he appeals to a lot of very disreputable elements on the right, but he also has a fair amount of support in the American Jewish community because he is so pro-Israel. And I'm sympathetic to things like moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem because, in fact, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. But what I think that Trump is going too far in giving Benjamin Netanyahu a blank check. And in fact, Bibi is kind of the Israeli version of Trump, utterly amoral, pursuing his own self-interest, making disreputable alliances with far-right parties in Israel as well as in Europe and elsewhere. And at the end of the day, I don't think that actually Donald Trump is going to be good for the Jews because I think what Donald Trump is doing is he is hyper-politicizing American support for Israel. He is turning it into a political football. And the Israeli-U.S. alliance, for much of its history, has enjoyed bipartisan support. And you saw some of that even fading before Donald Trump came along because I think there is more sympathy on the left side of the political spectrum for Palestinians. You see it with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who is not only sympathetic to Palestinians, but in fact says things that are widely and rightly denounced as anti-Semitic. I think she's still a very marginal voice on the left, but look at what happened with the Labour Party in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, where he has institutionalized hostility to Israel and anti-Semitism. I think those are very dangerous trends, and we're not necessarily going to go there, but I think what Donald Trump is doing is very deleterious to Israel's long-term security because he is really rooting support for Israel among a fringe of the American right. And what happens when Republicans are not in power in the future? Israel is going to have a Democratic administration, which is probably going to be a lot less sympathetic to Israel, especially if Netanyahu is in power than previous Democratic administrations were. And the final question was about American, grand strategy going forward, I guess appropriately enough in this forum. And I do think that the best American grand strategy is the same one that we have been pursuing since arguably, let's say, 1942, which is to create a Pax Americana in concert with our allies, and basically to support this alliance system of American allies, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Australia, and newer allies like Vietnam or India or Indonesia and Asia, or NATO and our European allies, to support those allies and also to support the cause of free trade, even if it costs us, a little bit of a trade deficit in the short run. It actually creates greater opportunities for the entire world. And I think this system of American alliances and free trade has really underwritten the greatest expansion of peace and prosperity in human history, the longest period without a great power conflict. And I think that is what we need to continue doing. And I think there is actually a lot of hunger for that now because, even though people are deeply suspicious of America under Trump, and rightly so, he is engaging in unilateral soft power disarmament to a shocking degree. But nevertheless, people still want the United States to be this kind of benevolent hegemon, to be this balancer against local bullies, whether it's Russia and Europe or China and Asia. All those countries are looking to America to balance these illiberal rising powers in their neighborhoods that threaten their own sovereignty. And so I think there is a need and a desire for America to continue leading what used to be known as the free world. But I think it's becoming harder and harder because I think people are losing confidence in America the longer that Donald Trump is in power, because he is so hostile to this American system of security alliances and free trade. We've never had a president since 1945 so hostile to the underpinnings of American power and the bipartisan foreign policy and trade policy that administration after administration has pursued since the days of Harry Truman.
That's interesting. I guess, yeah, well, I think it would be, I think I would make the case that there's actually a deeper skepticism about the benevolence of American power in much of the world, and that is, perhaps is that so that I guess, yeah, maybe it's a sense. Do you think the crisis is a crisis of the Pax Americana or the conservative movement, or is there a kind of a broader crisis, which is what this moment is coming out of? And I think that I'm not sure that yeah, I guess I'm not sure that simply shoring up what existed before is either possible or adequate as a solution to the problems that we confront going forward, both domestically and internationally.
All right, well, we'll leave
On
it
that
on
cheerful
that
note.
slightly ominous note, but that will be the task of the generation of people who are sitting here to figure that all out. Thank you, Max Boot and Kim Phillips-Fein, for this fascinating conversation, and to all of you for participating.